You are the architect of your life. The secret Carl Jung tried to tell you everything you call fate might just be the architecture of your own unconscious. Jung said, until you make it conscious, it will direct your life and you'll call it destiny. So the question is, who's designing your life right now? You or your shadow? Part 1. The unconscious blueprint, how you became who you are. Every human being begins life inside a psychological architecture that is not their own. Before you could speak, before you could choose, you were already being shaped by forces beyond your awareness. The family you were born into, the beliefs spoken in your home, the silence that followed certain words and the gestures of those who raised you, all of these created a blueprint for your psyche. Carl Jung believed that much of who we are is not consciously designed. Instead, it is a structure built by the unconscious, a vast inner realm that holds forgotten memories, instinctual drives, ancestral patterns, and the emotional residue of every experience you've ever had. The unconscious, Jung said, is not just a hidden storage of suppressed thoughts. It is an active architect. It builds, organizes, and directs the psyche long before the ego takes shape. When you were a child, you absorbed not only your parents' behavior, but their unresolved conflicts. You mirrored their emotional patterns like wet clay taking the form of invisible hands. If your mother feared abandonment, you might have inherited her vigilance. If your father carried silent shame, you might now wear his armor without realizing it. These psychological imprints are what Jung called complexes, clusters of emotion, memory, and meaning that act like living subpersonalities inside the psyche. Complexes are not evil. They are autonomous fragments of psychic life. They react, defend, and even sabotage you at times, but they are also clues, traces of your early conditioning and your unconscious story. When you lash out without understanding why, when you fall in love with people who repeat your childhood pain, when you sabotage your success right before you achieve it, a complex is in control. Jung compared this to being possessed not by demons but by your own disowned emotions. Until you bring these patterns into awareness, they govern your life from the shadows. This is what Jung meant when he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Fate is often just unexamined repetition. You think you're choosing, but you're reenacting. The people you attract, the jobs you pursue, the fears that stop you, all of them stem from an invisible architecture inside you. The unconscious blueprint defines what feels familiar, and therefore safe. Even when familiar is painful, the psyche prefers it because it knows the map. Change threatens the inner architect's stability. Jung observed that the unconscious is intelligent but not moral. It doesn't care whether a pattern serves your happiness, it cares only about wholeness. That means it will repeat pain, conflict, and dysfunction until you finally face the truth beneath them. The purpose is integration, not punishment. Every conflict, every heartbreak, every breakdown is an invitation to redesign the inner structure of your life consciously. The unconscious wants to be seen, and it uses suffering as its language. To understand how deeply this blueprint runs, consider how early conditioning molds identity. A child who grows up in chaos might unconsciously build a life filled with crisis as an adult. Another raised in emotional neglect might chase validation, endlessly mistaking attention for love. Jung would say these are not random choices, they are psychic compensations. The psyche attempts to restore balance by seeking externally what was missing internally, but no external source can complete an inner architecture built on avoidance. The ego, which forms as we grow, believes it is the sole builder of life. It sets goals, makes plans, and tries to control outcomes. But underneath, the unconscious still holds the original design, the emotional scaffolding of your being. When the ego's desires conflict with that design, inner tension arises. You may experience anxiety, depression, or existential fatigue. Jung called this the tension of opposites, the psychic friction between conscious will and unconscious truth. This tension is not a sign of failure, it is a call to awareness. It signals that the time has come to participate in your own construction consciously. Every psychological symptom in Jung's view is a message encoded in symbol. Anxiety is not the enemy. It's the psyche knocking on your door saying, "You're living in a structure too small for your soul." Depression might be the foundation cracking because you built your life on external validation rather than authentic desire. These symptoms are not random malfunctions, they are part of the psyche's self-regulating mechanism trying to guide you back toward wholeness. When you start to observe these inner messages, you realize that your life has been a collaboration between your conscious choices and your unconscious architecture. Jung compared the psyche to a house. The upper rooms represent consciousness, what you know about yourself, what you show the world. The basement, however, contains the unconscious, everything you hide, forget, or deny. Most people live only on the upper floor, pretending the basement doesn't exist. But the noises from below never stop. Nightmares, emotional triggers, mysterious fears, all come from that lower level of the psyche demanding recognition. To truly be the architect of your life, you must descend into that basement. You must see what lies beneath the foundations you inherited. Jung called this the shadow, the sum of all the qualities you reject or repress in yourself. The shadow is not purely negative. It contains both darkness and unused light, creativity, strength, sexuality, and intuition that were exiled because they didn't fit the image you were told to maintain. To ignore the shadow is to build a house with half its rooms sealed off. It might look perfect from the outside, but it will never feel like home. This is why many people experience midlife crises or spiritual awakenings. The unconscious begins to revolt against the false architecture the ego has built. The persona, the social mask, starts to crack, revealing the unfinished parts of the self. What looks like chaos is actually transformation. The old structure must collapse for a new one to emerge. Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. The breaking point is not destruction, it's revelation." Let's take an example. Imagine a woman who spent her life being the good girl. She suppresses anger, avoids conflict, and defines herself through others' approval. On the surface, she seems composed, but inside she's suffocating. When a relationship ends, her world falls apart. She enters therapy and begins to dream of earthquakes destroying her house. Jung would interpret the dream as the unconscious shaking the false foundation. The house represents her psychological structure, the persona she built to survive. The earthquake is the psyche's demand for authenticity. Through this symbolic collapse, she is invited to rebuild her life from truth rather than adaptation. Jung believed that dreams are the blueprints of the soul. Each dream reveals the inner architect's adjustments. When you ignore them, your life remains confined by outdated structures. But when you study them, you collaborate with the unconscious, transforming it from an unseen builder into a conscious partner. Dreams, symbols, synchronicities, and emotional triggers all guide you toward integration. They are messages from the deeper self, the central organizing principle of the psyche that strives for wholeness. The unconscious also holds collective patterns, what Jung called the collective unconscious. These are the universal symbols, myths, and archetypes shared by all humanity. Your personal story is interwoven with these timeless patterns. The hero, the mother, the trickster, the wise old man, these archetypes shape the architecture of every psyche. When you act out certain roles in life, you are unconsciously embodying these forces. Recognizing them gives you the power to choose your narrative consciously. For example, the archetype of the victim might dominate someone who feels powerless. Until they become aware of it, they will keep attracting situations that confirm that role. Once they see the pattern, they can shift from victim to creator, from being built by life to building life itself. Jung emphasized that transformation happens when we identify with the self rather than the ego. The ego says, "Life happens to me." The self says, "I am life expressing itself through me." This shift marks the birth of the true architect. To rewrite your blueprint, you must observe how you project your inner world onto others. Jung explained projection as the psyche's way of externalizing what it cannot yet accept within itself. When you admire someone's strength or despise someone's arrogance, you're perceiving aspects of your own shadow. These projections are clues. They reveal what your unconscious is trying to integrate. The more conscious you become of your projections, the more control you gain over the architecture of your reality. Relationships are powerful mirrors for this process. They reveal the hidden blueprints more clearly than solitude ever could. That's why people repeat the same relationship patterns even after swearing they won't. The psyche recreates familiar dynamics, not because it enjoys suffering, but because it seeks resolution. The unconscious keeps designing similar rooms until you finally recognize the layout and choose to remodel. When you understand this, every heartbreak becomes a revelation, the map of your inner architecture drawn in the shape of another person. The path to conscious authorship begins with awareness. Awareness dismantles the invisible scaffolding of conditioning. But awareness alone isn't enough. You must also engage the imagination, the creative force Jung called active imagination. Through journaling, visualization, art, or dialogue with inner figures, you allow the unconscious to speak. You become both the architect and the material. The psyche builds itself through your participation. This is not metaphorical, it's experiential. Those who practice self-reflection, dream work, or inner dialogue often describe a sense of inner expansion, as though the walls of their psychological house are being widened to let in more light. Jung insisted that every individual carries within them the potential for transformation. The unconscious, though autonomous, responds to conscious collaboration. When you bring attention to a pattern, it begins to lose its grip. What was once automatic becomes a choice. This is the foundation of psychological freedom, the ability to respond rather than react. The architect of life is not the one who controls every outcome, but the one who understands the design principles behind experience. But transformation is uncomfortable. To rebuild your inner world, you must confront what you've buried. The child within you might resist, fearing that change means losing safety. The ego might cling to control. Yet Jung reminded us that what the unconscious seeks is not your destruction, it seeks your completion. Every descent into darkness is followed by rebirth. The architecture of the soul requires both collapse and construction. The ruins of the old self become the foundation of the new. Consider the symbolic process of alchemy, which Jung saw as a metaphor for psychological transformation. In alchemy, the base material must first be dissolved, reduced to its chaotic essence before it can be purified and reborn as gold. The same happens in the psyche. Your old identity must dissolve to reveal the raw material of your true nature. The depression, confusion, or crisis you experience during this time is the alchemical nigredo, the dark stage where the old structures melt away. What feels like loss is the beginning of a deeper design. Through this process, you start recognizing that your life is not happening randomly. Every event, pleasant or painful, serves the architecture of your individuation, the journey toward becoming whole. The people who hurt you, the failures that humbled you, the opportunities that appeared at just the right time, all were placed by the inner architect to refine your understanding of self. Nothing is wasted. Every fragment has meaning. Jung's psychology restores sacredness to the ordinary by revealing that everything you experience is part of your construction process. The unconscious is not just personal, it's sacred. It's the realm where the divine blueprint meets human experience. When Jung said that the psyche has a religious function, he meant that it seeks connection with something larger than the ego. To be the architect of your life, you must design with both dimensions in mind, the personal and the transpersonal. The conscious mind plans, the unconscious provides inspiration, the ego builds, the self breathes life into the structure. What does this mean practically? It means that self-awareness is the cornerstone of your design. Pay attention to your emotional reactions, they reveal where the blueprint still operates unconsciously. Observe your recurring dreams, they show the hidden floor plans of your psyche. Reflect on your projections, they highlight which parts of your architecture you've denied. Each insight is like uncovering an old map, showing you where the walls need to be moved and where the light can enter. Becoming the architect of your life is not about perfection, it's about participation. You do not erase your past, you repurpose it. The bricks of your old wounds become the stones of wisdom. The shadows that once haunted you become the pillars of your strength. In Jungian psychology, healing is not erasing pain, but integrating it. You build a stronger structure by acknowledging every part of yourself, especially the ones you once rejected. And as you do this, something extraordinary happens. The unconscious begins to trust you. It stops sending crises and starts sending inspiration. Synchronicities appear meaningful coincidences that confirm you're aligned with your deeper design. Life starts to feel less like a battlefield and more like a collaboration. The architect and the architecture merge. You become both the builder and the masterpiece. Every person carries an inner cathedral waiting to be completed. The unconscious has already laid the foundations, the raw materials of emotion, desire, fear, and memory. Consciousness provides the blueprint that transforms chaos into order. When these two forces work together, the result is authenticity. You no longer live according to inherited scripts. You create from essence. This is what Jung meant by becoming individuated, a person whose inner and outer lives are in harmony. You are not merely living inside your psyche, you are constructing it every day through choice, awareness, and courage. Every thought you entertain, every truth you confront, every emotion you integrate is another beam, another window, another bridge in your inner structure. The unconscious will continue to offer challenges, but once you understand its language, you stop fearing its storms. You start seeing them as the necessary forces that shape your evolution. In the end, you realize something profound. The architecture of your life was never about control, it was about consciousness. You were never meant to live inside a fixed design. You were meant to evolve the design itself. Part 2. Individuation, the moment you take back the pen. At some point in every conscious life, there comes a silent rebellion against the architecture that once defined you. It happens quietly, sometimes after a heartbreak, a loss, or a period of exhaustion. You begin to feel a split between the life you're living and the life that feels true. That tension, Jung said, is not a sign of madness, but the birth cry of individuation. It is the moment the self demands authorship over the story the ego has been reciting blindly. Individuation is not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. It's the process of reclaiming the pieces of yourself that were denied, forgotten, or sacrificed in order to fit into society's design. It is the moment when you stop being a character in someone else's script and start writing your own. To Jung, this was the highest human task, the unfolding of your inherent potential, guided not by the ego's ambitions, but by the deeper intelligence of the unconscious self. The ego, of course, resists this process. It has spent years constructing its identity like a fragile tower of control. It has invested everything in the illusion that it knows who you are. But individuation dismantles that illusion. It asks you to question your loyalties to culture, to family, to ideology, to the stories you tell yourself about success, love, and purpose. It requires the courage to stand naked before your own psyche and admit, I am not who I thought I was. Jung saw this confrontation as a sacred necessity. He believed that every individual carries within them an inner destiny, a pattern of becoming that cannot be fulfilled by imitation. The path of individuation begins when you sense this inner calling, when something deep inside you whispers that conformity is spiritual death. It is not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It is a movement toward authenticity, toward alignment with the self. The self in Jungian psychology is the totality of who you are, both conscious and unconscious, both shadow and light. It is not the ego, but the center and circumference of the entire psyche. The self is the true architect, and individuation is the process by which the ego gradually aligns with it. The journey feels like disorientation at first. Your familiar habits lose meaning. The goals that once excited you now feel empty. Relationships may fall apart not because of failure, but because they were built on unconscious patterns. This period is what Jung called the night sea journey, a symbolic descent into the depths of the psyche. It mirrors the ancient myths of heroes who venture into darkness to retrieve a treasure or rescue a captive soul. In reality, the treasure is your own authenticity, and the captive is the part of you that has been imprisoned by adaptation. You may feel lost, but in truth you are entering the workshop of the self. The unconscious begins to reorganize your inner architecture, revealing new rooms of awareness that the ego never knew existed. During individuation, the unconscious starts sending you symbols, dreams, synchronicities, and emotional intensities that demand attention. Jung believed that these symbols are the psyche's way of communicating in its native language. When the ego listens, transformation begins. A dream of rebuilding a house might signify your psychological renewal. A recurring image of a child could represent your inner potential waiting to be nurtured. These are not random hallucinations. They are the blueprints of your rebirth. But individuation is not romantic. It is an ordeal. It often feels like your life is falling apart because the old structure must die before the new can emerge. You may experience loneliness, confusion, or what modern psychology calls an identity crisis. Jung would have called it a spiritual initiation. The disintegration of the old ego is necessary so that a new synthesis can form a self that is no longer at war with its unconscious depths. Many people turn away at this stage because they mistake pain for failure. But Jung insisted that suffering is the instrument of consciousness. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, he wrote. The tension, the confusion, the heartbreak, all of it is raw material for the new design. The psyche forces you to confront what you've avoided, not to punish you, but to make you real. In this process, the shadow becomes your first teacher. The shadow holds everything you refuse to acknowledge about yourself: anger, envy, greed, lust, but also strength, creativity, and instinct. When you integrate the shadow, you reclaim vitality. You stop being split between the person you pretend to be and the person you secretly are. The shadow teaches humility. It shows you that you are both saint and sinner, both builder and destroyer. Once you accept that truth, you stop projecting your darkness onto others and start transforming it into power. Jung often described encounters with the shadow as wrestling with the angel of the night. It's a brutal honesty that leaves no room for hypocrisy. You begin to see your own complicity in your pain. You realize that what you condemned in others lives within you. This recognition is the cornerstone of self-knowledge. It allows compassion to grow both for yourself and for others, because you understand that everyone is battling their own shadow. The next teacher on this path is the Anima or Animus, the inner opposite gender within each person. For a man, the Anima represents the inner feminine intuition, emotion, receptivity. For a woman, the Animus represents the inner masculine reason, assertiveness, and spiritual focus. Jung believed that most people project these figures onto romantic partners, confusing the inner need for wholeness with outer attraction. Individuation requires withdrawing these projections. When you reclaim your Anima or Animus, you integrate the missing polarity of your psyche. You become psychologically androgynous, balanced, complete, and capable of real relationship instead of projection-based attachment. Imagine a man who idolizes women but fears commitment. He has not integrated his Anima. His relationships will be ruled by fantasy and disappointment until he meets the feminine within himself, the capacity for vulnerability and emotional depth. Likewise, a woman who disowns her assertiveness may keep attracting dominating partners until she recognizes her inner animus, the masculine principle of strength and purpose. The moment she integrates it, she no longer needs to find it in others. This balance creates psychological sovereignty. You no longer depend on the external world to complete you. You become self-contained, capable of loving without losing yourself. This is one of the hallmarks of individuation relationships: shift from need to conscious choice. Love becomes an act of expansion rather than compensation. Another key element of individuation is the dissolution of the persona, the social mask you wear to navigate society. The persona is necessary. It helps you function and relate. But when you identify with it completely, you lose touch with your inner truth. The persona says, I must be nice even when you're angry. I must be successful even when you're miserable. It's the facade that hides your authentic self. Individuation cracks that mask. You begin to sense when your behavior is artificial, when your words are not aligned with your soul. And once you see the falsehood, you cannot unsee it. This dismantling often leads to existential anxiety because you realize that much of your life has been performance. But the collapse of the persona is the first real freedom. Without the mask, you begin to breathe. You start to speak from the center instead of the surface. Jung said that people often cling to their persona because they fear the chaos beneath it. Yet he argued, only those who can descend into the chaos can bring up new life. To become the architect of your life, you must learn to design from within rather than decorate from without. Society teaches you to build an image. Individuation teaches you to build an essence. When the persona dissolves, you are forced to meet your true self, not the version others praise, but the living reality that feels unmistakably yours. This encounter can be terrifying because authenticity demands responsibility. Once you know who you are, you can no longer blame others for your unhappiness. But the reward is inner authority. The individuated person does not depend on approval. They act from alignment, not from fear. They understand that every decision either strengthens or weakens their connection to the self. This awareness transforms ordinary life into a sacred practice. Every relationship becomes an opportunity to express wholeness. Every challenge becomes a test of integrity. Jung observed that individuation is not a straight line but a spiral. You revisit old patterns from a higher level of awareness. Each time you circle back, you understand the design more deeply. The goal is not to eliminate the unconscious, but to create a dialogue with it. The ego learns to listen rather than dominate. The unconscious, in turn, reveals its wisdom in symbols and intuition. This relationship between conscious and unconscious is what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychic bridge that unites opposites. When this function activates, you experience inner guidance. It's as if a deeper intelligence begins to participate in your daily life. You might feel drawn to certain people, books, or experiences that accelerate your evolution. Synchronicities, the meaningful coincidences Jung described, start to appear. These are not mere accidents but expressions of the psyche's self-organizing principle. They confirm that you are moving in harmony with your inner blueprint. Individuation also redefines your relationship with spirituality. It's no longer about external belief systems, but about direct experience of the numinous, the sacred presence within the psyche. Jung said that the self often appears in dreams and visions as symbols of wholeness, a mandala, a wise old man, a divine child, or a luminous circle. These images are not fantasies. They are psychic facts, manifestations of the self's organizing power. When you connect with this inner center, life takes on depth and meaning beyond rational comprehension. However, individuation is not narcissism. It is not about inflating the ego with spiritual superiority. Jung warned of this danger in those who confuse the self with the ego and become intoxicated with their own enlightenment. True individuation humbles you. It reveals how small the ego is compared to the vastness of the psyche. The individuated person does not claim mastery over life, they serve it. They understand that they are both the artist and the artwork, both builder and clay. As the process unfolds, old desires lose their grip. You no longer chase recognition because your sense of worth arises from within. You no longer fear solitude because you are in dialogue with your inner world. You begin to make decisions not from compulsion but from inner alignment. Life becomes simpler yet richer. You start seeing meaning in everything, every conflict, every coincidence, every silence. Jung described this as the movement from fate to destiny, when you stop being driven by unconscious forces and start cooperating with your inner pattern of growth. To reach this level of consciousness, you must cultivate reflection. Jung valued introspection not as rumination but as active engagement with the unconscious. Writing down dreams, meditating, analyzing emotional reactions, all are ways of decoding the messages of the self. He believed that the modern individual's greatest task is not to conquer the world, but to understand their own soul, because only by knowing yourself can you contribute authentically to humanity. The individuated person lives in paradox. They are strong yet humble, rational yet intuitive, grounded yet open to mystery. They have integrated their light and shadow, their masculine and feminine, their personal and collective dimensions. They are not free from struggle, but their struggle has meaning. They see life as a dialogue between the finite and the infinite, between form and essence. This balance gives them psychological resilience, an inner architecture that can withstand chaos without collapsing. Jung often compared individuation to the growth of a tree. The roots go down before the branches rise. The deeper you descend into your own darkness, the higher your consciousness can reach toward light. You cannot bypass the underworld. Every authentic transformation begins in the soil of your own soul. The deeper your roots, the stronger your branches. And like a tree, you don't grow by force. You grow by surrendering to the natural rhythm of your being. In a culture obsessed with speed and external success, individuation is revolutionary. It asks you to slow down and listen inwardly. It invites you to trust intuition over trends, authenticity over acceptance. Jung believed that the fate of humanity depends on this inner revolution, on individuals who are conscious, integrated, and capable of independent thought. He warned that societies collapse when people lose touch with their inner life and become possessed by collective hysteria. The individuated person, by contrast, becomes an anchor of sanity in a chaotic world. The moment you begin to individuate, you take back the pen of your life. You stop reacting to inherited scripts and start composing from truth. You realize that meaning is not given, it is created through consciousness. This realization changes how you view suffering, failure, and success. You see them as necessary contrasts in the architecture of becoming. The cracks in your walls are no longer flaws. They are openings for light. In the later stages of individuation, you experience what Jung called integration with the self. This is not enlightenment in the mystical sense, but a profound harmony between conscious and unconscious. You feel guided, but not controlled. You make choices that feel both free and fated, as if the deeper self writes through you. Life becomes art, and you its conscious artist. You understand that every event, every emotion, every loss was part of the design, leading you here to the realization that the architect you've been searching for was always you. Part 3. Building the inner architecture, shadow, anima, and the self. Every transformation begins within. The moment you commit to living consciously, you step into the construction site of your own psyche. Nothing external changes first. The people around you, your environment, your work, they might all stay the same for a while. But internally, invisible blueprints start shifting. Walls begin to tremble. Rooms you never knew existed start opening. Jung called this process building the inner architecture, the deliberate act of transforming chaos into order, fragmentation, into wholeness, and unconscious forces into living consciousness. The psyche is not random. It has structure. Jung described it as a kind of psychic house composed of layers: the persona, ego, shadow, anima, divided by animus, and at the deepest core, the self. Most people live only in the outer rooms of this inner home, rearranging furniture, but never questioning the foundation. They decorate their persona, the mask they wear in society, and call it identity. But the individuated person ventures deeper into the basement of the shadow and the sanctuary of the self. That descent is where true construction begins. The shadow is the first architectural layer that demands renovation. It's the collection of all qualities you've disowned, denied, or projected onto others. It contains everything you consider unacceptable: your anger, envy, pride, sexuality, laziness, greed, but also your hidden talents, courage, and creative power. Jung said the shadow is 90% pure gold if you have the courage to face it. What makes it dark is not its content, but your rejection of it. The shadow forms in childhood when you learn which parts of you are allowed and which are forbidden. Maybe you were told to be polite, so you buried your assertiveness. Maybe you were rewarded for being responsible, so you suppressed playfulness. Over time, you built a false self, a structure designed to please and survive while locking away the rest of you in the basement. The problem is that whatever you repress doesn't disappear. It becomes autonomous, operating from the dark, influencing your reactions and choices. The more you deny it, the more power it gains. That's why you might find yourself repeating the same mistakes, drawn to the same toxic patterns. The architect within is trying to show you the weak spots in your foundation. Jung believed that the shadow must be confronted directly, not by judgment but by integration. To integrate means to acknowledge the disowned parts of yourself and give them a place in consciousness. The shadow is not an enemy to be destroyed, it's an unlit room of your own house waiting for you to turn on the light. Every time you admit, yes, I am capable of anger, yes, I have envy, yes, I want power, you reclaim psychic energy that was trapped in repression. You take back ownership of your inner architecture. Facing the shadow is uncomfortable because it shatters the image you've built. It forces humility. You realize that you're not just a victim of life, but also its participant. That your suffering is not always unjust, but sometimes self-created. Jung called this encounter the moral problem of the modern individual. It's easy to blame others for your pain. It's much harder to recognize your role in perpetuating it. But this self-recognition is the cornerstone of consciousness. It's how the builder matures. Imagine someone who believes they are always nice. They avoid confrontation, pride themselves on kindness, and think of anger as immoral. Yet behind the persona resentment festers. They feel used, invisible, unappreciated. Eventually they explode or collapse in burnout. Their shadow, the disowned capacity for aggression and self-assertion, erupts from repression. Integration would mean learning that anger in its conscious form is not evil but protective. It guards boundaries, preserves dignity, and demands truth. The goal is not to suppress anger, but to channel it constructively. This is what Jung meant when he said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The process of shadow integration transforms you from a passive inhabitant of your psyche into an active architect. You start noticing how you project your own darkness onto others. You see that the traits you criticize most intensely in others are usually your own unacknowledged qualities. For example, when you label someone arrogant, you might be denying your own desire for confidence. When you despise someone's manipulation, you might be ignoring your own capacity to influence. Every projection is a mirror, showing you a hidden piece of your structure. Once you accept this, relationships become mirrors for growth rather than battlegrounds of blame. Integration of the shadow gives birth to psychological strength. You become less reactive, less fragile. When someone accuses you, you don't crumble because you've already met your darkness. No insult surprises you anymore. You know what lives inside you, both the beauty and the brutality, and that self-knowledge becomes your foundation. The ego stops pretending to be pure and begins to cooperate with the deeper psyche. This cooperation marks the beginning of conscious design. After facing the shadow, the next dimension that unfolds is the anima or animus, the inner contrasexual archetype. Jung observed that every man carries within him a feminine principle, the anima, and every woman carries a masculine principle, the animus. These are not gendered roles, but psychological energies, complementary forces that must unite for wholeness to emerge. The anima represents emotion, intuition, creativity, empathy, and the capacity to relate. It's the doorway to the unconscious, the bridge between reason and feeling. When a man represses his anima, he becomes emotionally detached, overly rational, and disconnected from his inner life. He might compensate by idealizing women, projecting onto them the tenderness he cannot access within himself. He becomes dependent on them to feel alive. Only by integrating his anima, learning to listen, to feel, to surrender control, can he achieve inner harmony. The integrated man becomes creative, receptive, and deeply connected to meaning. He no longer needs to find love outside himself because he embodies it internally. The animus, in contrast, is the inner masculine energy within women. It represents logic, strength, direction, and purpose. When repressed, a woman may feel powerless, indecisive, or dependent on external authority. She might project her animus onto men, falling for those who seem decisive or strong but often oppressive. Integrating the animus means claiming her own authority, learning to think independently, set goals, and act decisively. Once integrated, she no longer seeks validation from others. She becomes psychologically sovereign, grounded in her own masculine energy. When both anima and animus are integrated, an extraordinary balance emerges. You become both soft and strong, intuitive and rational, receptive and assertive. Jung called this psychological androgyny the union of opposites within the psyche. It's not about erasing gender differences, it's about harmonizing inner polarity. The individuated person contains both poles and can move fluidly between them. They can act decisively without losing compassion and love without losing boundaries. This balance is what gives rise to genuine creativity and authentic relationships. In mythology, this union is symbolized by sacred marriages, the alchemical conjunctio, or divine conjunction. Two opposites merge to form a third thing, a higher unity. Jung believed this alchemical metaphor expressed the psyche's deepest drive to reconcile opposites and create wholeness. When the masculine and feminine unite within you, you experience a new stability. The conflict between logic and feeling, between control and surrender, resolves into creative tension. You stop oscillating between extremes and begin living from the center. But to reach that center, one must encounter the self, the ultimate architect within. Jung described the self as both the goal and the origin of psychological development. It is not merely the sum of your parts, it is the organizing principle that gives your life direction and meaning. The self manifests as symbols of totality, mandalas, circles, divine figures, or radiant light. It appears in dreams when the psyche is ready to transcend fragmentation. The self doesn't erase the ego, but places it in proper relation to the whole. The experience of the self is profoundly humbling. You realize that your consciousness is only a small island in a vast sea of intelligence. The ego, which once thought it was the master builder, learns that it is merely a craftsman following a greater blueprint. Jung called this realization a religious function of the psyche, not religious in dogma but in reverence. You begin to sense that your life is guided by something larger than personal will. Synchronicities, meaningful coincidences become frequent. You feel aligned with the deeper flow of existence. When the self becomes active, your values shift. You stop asking, "What do I want?" and start asking, "What wants to emerge through me?" Life becomes less about control and more about participation. You no longer chase goals out of insecurity. You create from inner necessity. The self organizes your experiences toward growth. Even painful events reveal purpose in hindsight. Jung said that the self compels you toward what you most need to become whole, even if it means dismantling everything that feels safe. This stage of inner architecture is often symbolized by the mandala, a geometric pattern representing unity. Jung's patients often drew mandalas spontaneously during therapy, even without knowing their meaning. He interpreted them as images of psychic order, the psyche's way of expressing that it is reorganizing itself around the self. When you integrate shadow anima divided by animus and persona, the psyche naturally moves towards symmetry. You feel grounded, authentic, and connected. You are no longer tossed around by unconscious forces. You inhabit your own center, but the work is never finished. The psyche is dynamic, not static. Jung compared individuation to an ongoing dialogue between the ego and the self. The ego builds, the self designs, and the unconscious supplies material. Every conflict, every emotion, every relationship is a construction phase. The goal is not perfection but integration, the ability to live consciously with paradox. You are both light and dark, masculine and feminine, finite, and infinite. Wholeness is not achieved by eliminating opposites, but by holding them in creative tension. Let's illustrate this through an example. Imagine a man who has always lived from intellect. He prides himself on logic and control, dismisses emotions as weakness, and measures worth by productivity. One day, his life begins to crumble: burnout, failed relationships, depression. These crises are the psyche's architecture collapsing under imbalance. The anima, his emotional, intuitive side, has been exiled too long. Through dreams or therapy, he begins to reconnect with his feelings, perhaps through art or vulnerability. As he integrates his anima, his life gains warmth and depth. He starts to feel meaning again. What looked like failure was simply renovation. Or take a woman who identifies solely with nurturing and emotional sensitivity. She avoids conflict, fears independence, and relies on external validation. Over time, resentment builds. She feels trapped and unseen. Her repressed animus strength, clarity, purpose demands acknowledgement. When she learns to assert boundaries and pursue her ambitions, she doesn't lose femininity, she refines it. The balance between care and strength transforms her relationships and her sense of identity. She stops existing for others and starts existing from herself. Integration of these elements changes how you move through the world. You no longer need to control or please. You simply express what is true. You act from your center. Jung believed that when the self becomes the guiding principle, life takes on symbolic meaning. You begin to perceive your experiences as reflections of inner reality. External conflicts mirror internal dynamics. For example, a difficult boss might symbolize your own tyrannical inner critic. A relationship that feels suffocating might represent your fear of freedom. The world becomes a mirror of your architecture, revealing where alignment is missing. This awareness brings both freedom and responsibility. Freedom because you realize you are not at the mercy of fate. You are co-creating it. Responsibility because you can no longer blame others for your pain. The outer world simply shows the state of your inner structure. Change the architecture within and the outer world rearranges itself accordingly. When you live from the self, life becomes participatory art. You are no longer building walls of defense. You are designing spaces of consciousness. You recognize that every person, every emotion, every dream is an archetypal force shaping your evolution. The shadow keeps you humble. The anima or animus keeps you balanced. The self keeps you oriented toward wholeness. Together they form the sacred geometry of the psyche. But this process is not comfortable. Integration often feels like demolition before reconstruction. You may lose relationships that no longer resonate, careers that no longer reflect your truth, identities that no longer fit. The ego experiences this as loss, but the self experiences it as liberation. The old house must collapse to make space for the cathedral. Jung wrote, "We must be willing to give up the life we planned so as to have the life that is waiting for us." Building inner architecture is not about escape from reality. It's about grounding the spiritual in the psychological, the invisible in the visible. It's living with awareness that your inner and outer worlds are two faces of the same design. Each choice you make, each word, emotion, or silence shapes the structure of your soul. And as you refine your inner architecture, your external life reflects the harmony within. At this stage, you begin to feel a sense of inner spaciousness, an internal sanctuary that no external chaos can destroy. You can observe emotions without being consumed by them. You can hold contradictions without collapsing. You can walk through uncertainty with trust. This is the strength of the individuated soul, flexibility rooted in self-knowledge. Jung compared this stage to the alchemical rubedo, the reddening when the spiritual and material fuse. The self becomes embodied. The soul finds expression in daily life. You no longer divide your existence into spiritual and ordinary. Washing dishes, writing emails, walking in the rain, everything becomes sacred participation in the process of becoming. The architect and the architecture are one, And so the work continues. You keep building, refining, and balancing. The shadow will reappear in new forms. The anima or animus will demand new expressions, and the self will reveal deeper layers of meaning. Each cycle of integration makes your inner structure more resilient and your consciousness more luminous. You no longer seek stability from the outside world because you've built it within. This is the essence of Jung's vision, the transformation of human consciousness into a living structure of wholeness, a house of soul where every room is inhabited, every wall is conscious, and every corner is filled with light. Part 4. Designing a conscious life living authentically. Once you have begun to integrate the shadow, embrace the inner feminine or masculine, and awaken the self, the question naturally arises: how do I live from this awareness? It is one thing to understand the psyche in theory. It is another to embody that knowledge in daily existence. Jung believed that consciousness is meaningless if it does not alter the way you live, love, and create. To live authentically means to design your life, not around fear, expectation, or imitation, but around your inner truth, the architecture of your soul rather than the architecture of the world. Living consciously begins with alignment. Every decision, every relationship, every pursuit becomes a reflection of your inner structure. Before individuation, the ego lives reactively, chasing pleasure, avoiding pain, conforming to inherited values. After individuation begins, you start to act intentionally. You no longer move through life unconsciously repeating patterns. You become aware of why you choose, and that awareness itself transforms the choice. Jung said that freedom is not the absence of limitations, it is the ability to relate consciously to them. You can never escape the conditions of existence, but you can learn to participate in them as a creator rather than a victim. Designing a conscious life does not mean creating perfection. It means creating participation. The ego wants control, but the self wants connection, a dialogue between inner and outer worlds. When you live authentically, you design with both materials, the known and the unknown, the light and the shadow, the human and the divine. You make peace with paradox. You accept that your life will always contain tension because consciousness grows through opposites. You learn to carry that tension without collapse. Every authentic life begins in inner silence. Without silence, you cannot hear the blueprint within you. The modern world worships noise, opinions, data comparisons, constant stimulation, yet the self speaks in whispers. To hear it, you must create inner space. Jung himself often retreated into solitude at his tower in Bollingen, where he built with his hands the symbol of his inner world, a stone house without electricity or distraction. He said that in that solitude he could hear the voice of the self more clearly than anywhere else. Solitude is not loneliness. It is communion with your own depths. When you stop running from silence, your life begins to align with your inner truth. Living authentically also requires courage because authenticity always disrupts adaptation. When you start making choices from the self rather than the persona, you will inevitably disappoint someone. The persona was built to please. The self is here to live. You may lose relationships, jobs, or identities that were built on pretense. Jung warned that individuation isolates you at first, not because you reject others, but because few people live with that level of consciousness. You walk between worlds, the outer world of conformity and the inner world of truth. This in-between space is what Jung called the transcendent position, the place where consciousness expands by holding opposites. To live authentically, you must constantly differentiate between ego desire and soul calling. The ego asks, what will make me comfortable? The soul asks, what will make me whole? The ego seeks validation. The soul seeks meaning. The difference is subtle but profound. Ego desires come from fear and lack. Soul callings arise from curiosity and purpose. When you follow a soul calling, you often feel both terror and excitement, a sense of stepping into something larger than yourself. Jung described this as the pull of destiny, the self urging the ego toward its next level of integration. Authentic living, therefore, demands self-observation. You become both the builder and the witness of your life. Every reaction becomes a mirror. When you feel envy, you ask, what part of me longs to be expressed? When you feel anger, you ask, what boundary have I violated or allowed to be violated? When you feel anxiety, you ask, what truth am I avoiding? These questions replace judgment with curiosity. Instead of labeling emotions as good or bad, you treat them as messages from the unconscious. Each feeling becomes an architect's note, a signal about what needs attention in your inner design. In a conscious life, even failure becomes a form of feedback. Jung believed that neurosis, anxiety, depression, frustration often appears when a person is living against their inner law. These symptoms are not random. They are the psyche's way of saying, something in your life no longer fits the blueprint. Instead of medicating or escaping the discomfort, the individuated person listens. They ask what the symptom is trying to reveal. Often it points to unlived potential. Depression may be the soul's protest against inauthentic goals. Anxiety may be energy trapped in the wrong pursuit. When you adjust your outer life to match your inner truth, the symptoms begin to dissolve, not because you suppressed them, but because you understood them. Authenticity also requires a new relationship with time. The ego lives in hurry. The self moves in rhythm. Jung observed that the psyche unfolds according to its own timing, what he called the kairos, the right moment. You cannot force individuation. Just as a flower opens when ready, consciousness expands when the conditions are right. Living authentically means surrendering to that rhythm. You stop rushing your process. You learn to trust that what seems delayed or lost may be gestating beneath the surface. Patience becomes an act of faith in the intelligence of your own soul. A conscious life is therefore not rigid but organic. It evolves. Jung compared the psyche to a tree whose roots go deep into the unconscious, while its branches reach toward the light of awareness. The individuated person tends to both they honor instinct and cultivate reason. They feed the roots as they grow the branches. Many people try to live only from the upper branches, ideas, appearances, intellect, while ignoring the roots of feeling and instinct. But without the dark nourishment below, consciousness dries out. Living authentically means allowing both levels to coexist. You let instinct inform thought and thought refine instinct. That balance creates vitality. Authenticity also transforms your relationships. Before individuation, relationships often serve unconscious needs, the desire for approval, the projection of unintegrated qualities, the repetition of childhood dynamics. After individuation begins, you relate differently. You no longer seek completion through others, but communion. You see each person as a mirror of your own psyche. When conflict arises, you ask what it reveals about your inner architecture. You no longer demand that others fill your voids because you have begun to fill them yourself. Love becomes an exchange between two whole beings, not a transaction between two half-selves. Jung described this as eros in its mature form, a spiritual bond rooted in consciousness rather than possession. In living authentically, you also learn the art of boundaries. The individuated person understands that compassion without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. The shadow integration teaches you to say no when necessary, not from anger, but from clarity. Every no to what is false is a yes to what is true. Boundaries are not walls. They are the architectural lines that define your sacred space. Without them, you collapse into others' projections and lose your shape. Conscious boundaries are acts of respect both for yourself and for others, because they allow relationships to exist between two differentiated beings rather than emotional entanglements. Another essential aspect of authentic life is creative expression. Jung considered creativity a natural byproduct of individuation. When psychic energy is no longer trapped in repression, it flows into imagination. Creativity is not limited to art. It is the ability to shape life itself, to design your days according to inner meaning rather than outer pressure. You might express it through painting, writing, gardening, building a business, or simply living with intention. Jung himself painted mandalas, carved stones, and built structures as ways of dialoguing with the unconscious. Every creative act becomes a conversation with the self, a way to externalize inner transformation into form. Living authentically also changes your relationship with suffering. You stop seeing pain as punishment and start recognizing it as initiation. Every difficulty becomes an opportunity to deepen consciousness. When you face pain consciously, it loses its power to destroy you. Instead, it becomes a sculptor carving away illusions to reveal essence. Jung taught that suffering expands the container of the soul. It forces you to hold more life. Avoidance, on the other hand, shrinks consciousness. The authentic individual no longer avoids the dark night of the soul. They enter it with awareness, knowing that light is born only in darkness. Designing a conscious life requires integrating spirituality into psychology. Jung emphasized that the human psyche has an innate religious function, a drive toward meaning and connection with something greater. This does not mean subscribing to dogma. It means recognizing the sacred in everyday life. The individuated person experiences the divine not as an external authority, but as an inner presence, the self. You start to see symbolic meaning in ordinary events. A conversation, a dream, a coincidence all carry messages from the deeper order. Life becomes a dialogue between you and the unknown. Synchronicities become the signatures of that dialogue. They appear when inner and outer realities align, when your inner architecture resonates with the universe's pattern. Jung described them as causal connections through meaning. In a conscious life, you pay attention to these events without superstition. They are not signs of control, but confirmation of participation. They remind you that consciousness and cosmos are intertwined, that the same intelligence building galaxies is shaping your psyche. Living authentically also transforms how you relate to death, not just physical death, but the countless deaths that occur throughout life: endings, losses, identity shifts. The ego fears death because it fears disappearance. But the individuated person understands that death is part of the psyche's design. Every ending creates space for rebirth. Jung viewed life as a series of deaths and resurrections, each psychological death freeing the self to expand. When you live consciously, you no longer cling to what is collapsing. You allow old forms to dissolve, trusting that something deeper is being born. In this way, authenticity becomes fluidity. You are not attached to a fixed identity. You change not from instability, but from evolution. The self is not static. It is a dynamic center that moves through cycles of transformation. Each time you shed an old persona, you step closer to your essence. Living authentically is not about arriving at a final version of yourself, it's about continually becoming. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. That becoming never ends." A conscious life also honors dreams, for dreams are the voice of the unconscious. In the dream world, the psyche reveals what the waking mind cannot see. By recording and reflecting on your dreams, you maintain communication with the self. Jung encouraged dream interpretation, not for prediction, but for integration. Dreams show you the unfinished rooms in your inner architecture, the aspects of self that seek inclusion. For instance, recurring dreams of being chased may symbolize unacknowledged fears. Dreams of flying might signal a readiness for freedom. By engaging with these images, you deepen your awareness of your own design. Authenticity also involves ethics, not the moral codes imposed by society, but the inner ethic that arises from consciousness. Jung called this individual ethics, the sense of responsibility that comes from knowing you participate in the collective psyche. When you act unconsciously, you add chaos to the world. When you act consciously, you bring order and meaning. The individuated person, therefore, lives with quiet integrity. They do not preach virtue, but embody it. Their life becomes their philosophy, a lived expression of alignment between inner truth and outer action. One of the most misunderstood aspects of authentic living is solitude. Many fear it because it confronts them with emptiness. Yet solitude is the sacred space where the self reveals itself. Jung often wrote that only in solitude can the individual distinguish their own voice from the collective noise. In solitude, you meet the gods within your archetypes, your dreams, your fears. You realize that you are never truly alone, for the unconscious is always with you. The more you inhabit your inner world, the less dependent you become on external validation you carry home within you. Living consciously also alters your relationship with the collective. Jung warned that societies built on mass consciousness, herd mentality, conformity, ideological possession, threaten the soul. Individuation is the antidote. The more individuals live authentically, the stronger the collective psyche becomes. Conscious individuals act as stabilizing forces in times of chaos. They bring meaning where there is confusion, compassion where there is cruelty, and awareness where there is blindness. To live authentically, therefore, is not selfish, it is service. Your wholeness contributes to the world's healing. A conscious life does not eliminate conflict, it transforms your relationship with it. You understand that every external conflict reflects an internal polarity. You approach disagreements not as battles to win, but as mirrors of your inner duality. You no longer fight for dominance. You seek understanding. The more you integrate opposites within, the more harmonious your outer world becomes. Peace begins in the psyche long before it appears in society. Authenticity also redefines success. The ego measures success by accumulation, wealth, recognition, control. The self measures it by alignment, truth, depth, integrity. A conscious person might live simply yet feel infinitely rich because their life resonates with meaning. Jung believed that meaning is psychological nourishment. Without it, the soul starves regardless of material abundance. The authentic individual chooses meaning over approval, purpose over comfort, and truth over illusion. When you live this way, your life gains symbolic coherence. You begin to see patterns, recurring themes, relationships, and challenges that all point toward a central motif. It's as if your soul is writing a story through experience. Each chapter has purpose, even if you don't understand it in the moment. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What is this teaching me?" That shift in perspective turns suffering into wisdom and randomness into order. The more consciously you live, the more your external life simplifies. You no longer scatter your energy chasing what doesn't matter. You become selective, not out of superiority, but out of alignment. You choose depth over distraction, quality over quantity, truth over convenience. You spend time with people who nourish your soul, engage in work that expresses your essence, and create environments that mirror your inner peace. Your home, your relationships, your habits all become extensions of your psyche. The outer architecture reflects the inner harmony. Living authentically also transforms how you perceive love. Love is no longer mere emotion. It is recognition, the recognition of another's soul through your own. Jung wrote that love is the union of two psychic realities that preserve their individuality while forming a larger whole. The individuated person loves without possession, supports without control, and communicates without projection. They understand that love is not found but cultivated, built through mutual awareness and shared growth. In this sense, love becomes a spiritual practice, a mirror through which both souls evolve. As you continue to live consciously, you realize that life itself is a process of ongoing individuation. There is no final arrival, no permanent enlightenment. Each new experience exposes a deeper layer of unconscious material to integrate. The work continues, but it becomes joyful rather than burdensome. You no longer fear the unknown. You welcome it as the next phase of your construction. The self keeps designing and the ego keeps learning. You are both the architect and the evolving masterpiece. Ultimately, living authentically means saying yes to your own existence, not the idealized version, but the real one with all its complexity, contradiction, and mystery. It is a life designed from the inside out, built on awareness rather than imitation, guided by the self rather than by fear. It is not an escape from the world, but a deeper engagement with it. The conscious individual walks among others not as a saint or prophet, but as a presence of wholeness, grounded, aware, and alive. The truth is, you've been building your life all along, brick by brick, belief by belief, but now you build with awareness. You are not a victim of fate. You are its designer. Jung didn't want us to escape the unconscious. He wanted us to become its architect. And that's where true freedom begins.